Well, to have this discussion, we have Murigi Kamande, who is a constitutional lawyer, who is at our City Center studios, and we also have Steve Ogola, an advocate of the High Court, who is in studio with me. And earlier on, we were looking at the crackdown on NGOs, and well, that's something that we want to now shift from and possibly look at the petitions. One of the things, of course, Kenya is waiting for now is the next 14 days, where the Supreme Court has received 3 petitions, and this is to do with the election of President Uhuru Kenyatta. Let me start with you, Steve Ogola, because I know you are closely following this last night on where we are today as a country in terms of the petitions that have been put forth. We know the deadline was midnight yesterday, and late into the evening, we had quite a number of individuals and groups putting in these petitions.
Well, Gitonga, we have now officially about 3 petitions. One, we had to get information whether the one of, I don't know, black movement or something, whether that was accepted because they didn't have filing fee, and the registrar of the Supreme Court is not allowed to, that's a decision that only the Supreme Court can make if you have not paid filing fees. But I think insofar as the Mao petition is concerned, that was properly admitted. And the Njonjo Mue petition, represented by Haron Dubi, that's properly also admitted. Then we'll wait for the framing. I don't know whether you'd like me to highlight some of the key issues that are likely to be canvassed in this petition. We can expect briefly some of the issues to emerge. The issue of inclusion of Raila Odinga in the ballot paper, whether, because Raila had withdrawn from the race on 10th of October, and then now the question that must be settled in this petition before we move forward, actually that is the main question. What was the intended consequence of Raila's withdrawal? Did it mean that now election stood cancelled automatically? Because IBC privileged a different understanding. They said, well, tomorrow, which was the 11th, the Kuru judgment will be out. Let's wait and process this together. And then when the Kuru judgment was delivered, IBC's position was that the race is truly open for 8 people, and that is why we proceeded the election. So unless IBC pays a detailed attention to that issue about Raila's inclusion, it may cost Uhuru the presidency because the court, if not satisfied, may reverse it. Of course, the other issues in point form include the appointment of returning officers, the irregular gazettement of candidates after printing ballot papers, of course, the voter turnout that was conflicting figures, and of course, the Akombe exit, all this, and of course, the constituencies that have not voted. All these issues will be canvassed from different angles. But I think in my assessment, the 2 main issues that may jeopardize the re-election of Uhuru Kenyatta at the court, one is that clarity on the inclusion or non-inclusion of Raila Odinga as a candidate, and the voter turnout, because those are the 2 main issues. Because the voter turnout, if you look at the law carefully, and I've studied it, the law and IB's own regulations requires the presiding officers to send statistical data via text message, Gitonga, at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 1 p.m., 3 p.m.
Which they did
finally,
not do.
no, they did. And finally, at 5 p.m., the presiding officers were sending this voter turnout via text message to the constituency returning officer. The question that the Supreme Court will be interested to know, were they sending this voter turnout data from polling stations for the returning officers on amusement, or to compile and transmit the National Tallying Center? So it's possible that shortly after 5 p.m., the National Tallying Center would have had the final voter turnout. And what Chebukati was explaining to Kenyans as the logs, that was a second level of sending voter turnout. After you've counted and announced the results, as you transmit electronically, there was a dialog box there where you key in the statistical data sent via text message. You key in there in the KIMS kit, and then you transmit. The judges asked in the petition, how long does it take network to pick? So if IBC said it took them more than 24 hours to get the actual figure, if not well explained, that may be problematic. The rest of the issues, I'm sure, will not be as hotly canvassed or contested as those 2 main issues.
All right, and let me now cross over to Murigi Kamande on the 3 petitions and possibly what Kenyans should brace themselves for in the next 14 days. Now, we have 3 petitions here. Would the Supreme Court take all of them and possibly look at them all in one and possibly give answers to them individually, given that there's also a constitutional timeline of 14 days where they have to give a ruling?
Now, I do not know where we are getting the figure of 3 petitions. In my mind, we have 5 petitions.
Okay, go ahead.
And the first petition
which petitions are those?
Yes. We still do have Okiya Omtata's petition, even if it doesn't fall under Section 140, under Article 140. We still have another petition that was filed by the Institute for Democratic Governance, I think by IDG. That is also, I remember it was headed as a presidential petition. And then, to the best of my knowledge, there was a petition that had earlier been filed by one of the petitioners, that is Khalif Khalifa, that was filed on the eve of the presidential election. I think that those are three. And then the ones that was filed by the ones that were filed today, the one by John Jomue, and then the other one by Harun Mwau. But essentially, and I know that would also be contested, what I'm looking at, there's an issue that Steve has left out. And that is what forms the bulk of Harun Mwau's petition. And it is the issue of whether or not, in the conduct of the fresh presidential elections, IEBC ought to have conducted nominations. I remember this is a hotly contested issue. It's an issue that has also been highlighted in John Jomue's. It's actually the first issue. If you look at that petition carefully, their main contention also is on the issue of whether, indeed, that the fresh presidential election can be so properly so called in the absence of nominations. And therefore, all those issues, together also with the issue of whether the presidential election was conducted in accordance with Article 138, where it is provided that all the constituencies are supposed to participate in the elections, and also the other issue is whether the election was conducted in accordance with the principles laid down in Article 81 of the Constitution, and the issue that we are looking at is that if you look at Njonjo Mue's petition today, they've given an account of what they call as an environment that was not conducive for the purposes of conducting that election in terms of the issues of intimidation, in terms of violence that was witnessed during that period. So I think all those issues need to be canvassed. And if you look at all those petitions, they have similar issues running across them. And all of them have an effect on the final outcome as to the validity or otherwise of the presidential election. So in my mind, I believe that the rules provide that the Supreme Court can consolidate those petitions. And I believe that once we get to the pretrial conference for purposes of any of these two petitions, the issue of whether the consolidation should happen is going to arise. And for purposes of ensuring that the constitutional period of 14 days is adhered to for purposes of hearing and determination, it is my belief that as it was done in 2013 when I think petition number 3, 4, and 5 were consolidated, we will also have all these petitions consolidated and all determined together.
All right.
Let me just have a quick remark. It's important to clarify to Kenyans that some of these petitions will not be consolidated. And some of these petitions will not be determined within 14 days. Look at Article 140. It says a person may file a petition to challenge the election of the president-elect. The key word is there. The key phrase is challenge the election of the president-elect within 7 days after the declaration of results, meaning any petition filed before the declaration of results is not a petition for purposes of nullification of this election. So if that was the intended benefit, that will not be achieved in that petition. Secondly, it means that any petition filed before the declaration of results will not necessarily be determined within 14 days because it doesn't fall within the framework, the narrow framework of Article 140 in terms of petition. Number 3, the issue of consolidation will be a practical sense issue. So for me, in my view, in terms of determination within 14 days, we will only examine these 3 petitions. The other petitions will not be consolidated with these other 3, although they raise issues. But I think as we determine these 3 petitions, some of the issues in the other petitions will be addressed. Now, the issue about consolidation, you know, this election, and I saw one of those petitions, other than the Njonjo Mue petition, which I think is solid. This petition says that, what the constitution says is that you must cite as the respondent the person who was declared the president, in this case, Uhuru Kenyatta, the person who was doing the declaration, in this case, the Chebukati as the national returning officer, and of course, the institution managing the election Management Board, in this case, IEBC. That is the proper challenge of a presidential election within the framework of Article 140. Going forward...
Allow me to pause you just to get to some breaking news and news reaching us in the studio right now. Nyeri Governor Wahome Gakuru has been involved in a road accident along Thika Murang'a Road at Kabati on his way to Nairobi. Gakuru has been rushed to the Thika Level 5 hospital for treatment. Reports say the governor was with his driver at the time of the accident. The driver is said to be critically injured. We bring you more details on this developing story. I'll repeat that. And Nyeri Governor Wahome Gakuru has been involved in an accident along the Thika Murang'a Road at Kabati on his way to Nairobi. Gakuru has been rushed to the Thika Level 5 hospital for treatment. Reports say that the governor was with his driver at the time of the accident. The driver is said to be critically injured. We will bring you more details of this developing story as we get our reporters out there to give us more information and details. That's breaking news. Governor for Nyeri, Wahome Gakuru, involved in a road accident along the Thika Murang'a Road at Kabati on his way to Nairobi. Gakuru has been rushed to the Thika Level 5 hospital for treatment. Reports say the governor was with his driver at the time of the accident and the driver is said to be critically injured. We shall bring you more details of this developing story. Sorry, I cut you short on that just to bring in that news. But yes,
I wanted to bring the beneficial aspect of the other petitions, which are not necessarily filed for purposes of nullification, in the sense that even if the Supreme Court was to privilege a position that, yes, these ones will determine them in our own time, because the High Court already said anything relating to the election of the president can only be handled by the Supreme Court. So there could be many questions, some of which need not to be determined within 14 days. But what it does is this. It shows that Kenyans are increasingly putting IEBC to task. I think that's a good thing, because what I have said before, and I think Jubilee sort of neglected this, the person who cost, the institution that cost Uhuru Kenyatta the presidency on the 1st of September was IEBC. This time, if IEBC were to cost Uhuru the presidency again and to subject him to another election, I think there will be a case for removal of all these 7 commissioners on the ground of incompetence. Because you can't learn from what the Supreme Court said, you failed twice. So I think some of these election petitions actually auditing the process. You know, you're auditing the electoral process, the election management process, without necessarily having the intended consequence of cancelling the election. The election may be preserved, yes, because the court will examine whether the evidence there available is sufficient to overturn the election. Because the thing is this. When the court is processing an election petition, the court is not necessarily starting from a point of nullification.
Okay, allow me to bring in Commander right here, because I want him to maybe just weigh in on what you have said, and also looking at the fact that you've mentioned that IEBC is what cost Uhuru Kenyatta the 8th of August election, if at all he had won, because again that's in question. And also if this election again is nullified, then of course that would be a huge indictment on the IEBC. Your comments, Mr. Kamande?
First of all, allow me to comment on Article 140. I do agree with Ogola that the petitions that are contemplated under Article 140 are those ones that challenge the validity of the election, of the election of the presidency, of the president. But if we go back to 2013 decision, and which has been cited for the position that the Supreme Court has jurisdiction, it did decree as follows, and it said that there are those matters that arise in the process of an election and disputes that arise therein, and there could be questions that any of the a petitioner might approach court and seek clarification on. And it is on the basis of which you had the Moses Kuria petition in 2013, which challenged the inclusion of validity of spoilt votes, let's say of spoilt votes in the calculation, in the final calculation. And since it had a bearing on the outcome of the presidential election, it was consolidated with petition number 5. That was Raila Odinga and IEBC for purposes of hearing and determination within these 14 days. And therefore, whether we whether the Supreme Court in 2017 is going to depart from that interpretation, the wide interpretation of Article 140, is left for the court to be seen. But what I believe is, as of 2013, the decision that was there is that the Supreme Court said that it had wide powers to consider all the issues, not just the challenge in itself, the narrow interpretation of the challenge of the election petition, of the declaration, that any other issue arising from the conduct of that presidential election. And I believe it is on the basis of which the High Court, in petitions by Haron Mwau and the other one by Okoiti Omtata, referred and said that they did not have jurisdiction to entertain those matters, and said that since there were issues that related to a presidential election, that only the Supreme Court had exclusive jurisdiction over them. As to whether they should be determined within 14 days is another question. But it would be an academic exercise, for example, if those issues are determined and they have a bearing on the final outcome of this petition, but they are determined after the lapse of 14 days, of what essence would they be? All right. Two, on the issue of the IEBC is, if you look at these petitions, as the first and second petitioner, you have the chairman of the IEBC, who is the National Returning Officer, and also you have the IEBC, which is the body mandated to conduct the elections. Most of the arguments that are made in both petitions are on conduct and are relating to the two parties. So therefore, essentially, if any petition is going to be lost this time around, then definitely it is IEBC that is supposed to be blamed.
All right, it's now 4 minutes to 8, and we need to release KTN Home for Life and Style to begin. On KTN News, we continue with this conversation. When we come back, I want us to briefly look at governance. And generally speaking, we've had a long time where we've talked about Jubilee and NASA and Third Way Alliance and all that. But it is going to be a time where we look at governance generally. Kenya is over 50 years old, and why are we where we are today? Is it down to governance? And that's going to be where we'll start off when we come back briefly after this short break. For now, we release KTN Home. Goodbye, KTN Home. On KTN News, we'll be right back for more.